Picture a small garage in Los Altos, California. No fancy equipment, no investors, no grand office. Just two friends, a soldering iron, and an idea that most people around them thought was completely pointless. Fast forward 50 years, and that same idea would become a company worth more than the entire economy of most nations on Earth. This is the story of how Apple didn't just build computers, it built an empire. And to understand how they got to the top, we need to go back to where it all began, with two men named Steve. It's 1976. Steve Jobs is 21 years old, restless, obsessive, and convinced he's meant for something bigger. Steve Wozniak is the quiet genius, the engineer who can build things Jobs could only dream about. Wozniak had already designed a circuit board he called the Apple One, something he was originally going to just give away for free to fellow hobbyists at the Homebrew Computer Club. But Jobs saw something Wozniak didn't. He saw a business. He convinced Woz that they should sell it instead. So they did what any broke college dropouts would do. Jobs sold his Volkswagen van, Wozniak sold his calculator, and together they scraped together $1,300 to start a company. They named it Apple, supposedly because Jobs had just come back from an apple orchard and thought the name sounded friendly, approachable, nothing like the cold, intimidating tech companies of the time. It was also, conveniently, ahead of Atari in the phone book, a small detail that mattered more in those early days than anyone expected. The Apple One sold in small numbers, mostly to hobbyists who understood circuit boards, but then came the Apple II in 1977, and this is where things changed completely. It wasn't just a machine for engineers anymore. It had color graphics, it came in a sleek plastic case, and ordinary people, teachers, small business owners, families, could actually use it. The Apple II became one of the first mass-market personal computers in history, and it turned this tiny garage operation into a company generating hundreds of millions of dollars within just a few years. Schools started buying them by the thousands, and for an entire generation of American kids, their very first experience with a computer was an Apple. By 1980, when Apple went public, it created more millionaires overnight than any company had before it. Jobs himself, still in his 20s, was suddenly worth over $200 million. But success brought a new kind of pressure. In 1984, Apple launched the Macintosh with one of the most famous advertisements ever made, a commercial that aired during the Super Bowl and only ran once, yet is still studied in marketing courses today. The Macintosh introduced the world to the graphical interface and the mouse, ideas that felt like science fiction at the time. It should have been Apple's crowning achievement. Instead, it became the beginning of a crisis. The Macintosh sold poorly at first. It was expensive, slow, and lacked software. Tensions inside the company exploded. Jobs, known for his brutal perfectionism and difficult temperament, clashed constantly with Apple's CEO, John Sculley, a man Jobs himself had recruited from Pepsi, with the now famous line asking him if he wanted to sell sugar water for the rest of his life or come change the world. The power struggle came to a head in 1985, and in one of the most dramatic moments in corporate history, the board sided with Sculley. Steve Jobs, the man who had built Apple in his garage, was pushed out of his own company. What followed was nearly a decade of Apple drifting without direction. New products failed to capture attention. Costs spiraled. Competitors like Microsoft, who Apple had actually helped by allowing them early access to Macintosh technology, moved in aggressively with Windows and completely dominated the market Apple had pioneered. By the mid-1990s, Apple was hemorrhaging money, losing over $1 billion in a single year. Analysts openly speculated the company might not survive. Some suggested it should be sold off entirely, its brand quietly buried. Magazine covers at the time literally asked whether someone should just put Apple out of its misery. It looked like the story was over. Then came one of the greatest comebacks in business history. In 1997, in a moment that felt almost impossible, Apple acquired Next, the company Jobs had founded after leaving Apple, and brought Steve Jobs back into the fold. What happened next stunned everyone. Microsoft, Apple's fiercest rival, agreed to invest $150 million into Apple and committed to continuing development of Microsoft Office for Mac. It wasn't charity. Bill Gates needed Apple to survive to avoid antitrust scrutiny. but it was a lifeline that kept the lights on. Jobs took over as interim CEO and immediately began stripping the company down to its essence, cutting most of Apple's confusing product lineup from dozens of models down to just 4. Then came the Think Different campaign, featuring icons like Einstein, Gandhi, and Picasso, a message that wasn't really about computers at all. It was about identity. It told customers that buying Apple wasn't just a purchase, it was a statement about who you were. Shortly after, the iMac launched in 1998, translucent, colorful, unlike anything else on the market. It sold out almost instantly and gave Apple its first real profitable quarter in years. The comeback had officially begun, but nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared the world for what came next. In January 2007, Steve Jobs walked on stage and introduced something he called an iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator, all in one device. Then he paused and said, "These are not 3 separate devices, this is one device, and we are calling it iPhone." It's hard to overstate how much this single product changed everything. The iPhone didn't just create a new gadget category, it fundamentally rewired how humans interact with technology, with each other, and with information itself. A year later, Apple launched the App Store, and that decision quietly became just as important as the iPhone itself. Suddenly, developers around the world could build apps and share revenue with Apple, creating an entire economy that didn't exist before, one that today generates hundreds of billions of dollars annually for developers alone. This is when Apple stopped being just a computer company and became something far bigger, an ecosystem. Once you owned an iPhone, a Mac, and later an Apple Watch or AirPods, switching away became inconvenient, almost unthinkable. This strategy has a name in business: ecosystem lock-in, and Apple mastered it better than anyone in history. So how did all of this eventually push Apple past every other company on the planet in value? It wasn't one single decision. It was a combination of strategies executed with almost obsessive precision. Apple built a premium brand, positioning itself not as the cheapest option, but as the most desirable one, allowing it to charge higher prices while customers happily paid them and still lined up outside stores overnight for new releases. It controlled both hardware and software, a strategy called vertical integration, which let Apple create products that simply work better together than anything competitors could match. Marketing became an art form, turning product launches into cultural events watched by millions, complete with countdown timers and global anticipation. Customer experience became a priority at every single touchpoint, down to the design of their retail stores, which were built to feel more like museums than shops. Then Apple expanded into services, things like Apple Music, iCloud, and Apple Pay, creating a massive stream of recurring revenue that didn't depend on selling new hardware every year, a business so profitable it now generates tens of billions of dollars in pure margin annually. In 2020, Apple made perhaps its boldest move yet, ditching Intel processors and designing its own chips, called Apple Silicon, giving them full control over performance and efficiency in a way no competitor could replicate. And guiding this entire empire since 2011 has been Tim Cook, a man very different from Jobs, quiet, methodical, an operations genius who turned Apple's supply chain into arguably the most efficient in the world. Under Cook's leadership, less flashy but incredibly disciplined, Apple's value has multiplied many times over, eventually becoming the first American company to reach $1 trillion in value, and later the first to cross $3 trillion, a number so large it's genuinely difficult for the human mind to picture. Think about that for a moment. A company that began with 2 guys in a garage, that nearly went bankrupt, that fired its own founder, somehow became the most valuable company the world has ever seen. Apple's story isn't really about technology at all. It's about vision, about believing in an idea when almost nobody else does, about failing publicly and coming back stronger, and about never settling for good enough. Whatever you're building right now, whatever idea feels too small or too crazy, remember that Apple started in a garage too, with $1,300 and a belief that nobody else could see. If this story inspired you even a little, hit that like button, Subscribe for more deep dives into the world's biggest companies, and let me know in the comments which company's story you want us to tell next.